Good afternoon, India, and hello, Professor Thomas, uh, and everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2021. This is Rudra Narayan Das, Executive Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha. We are proud to announce that this conference is conducted along with Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, Central University of Odisha, Koraput, and Reliance University, Cuttack. In today's symposia, I would like to welcome our speaker for today, Professor Pradip Thomas, and participants across the globe through Facebook Live and YouTube Live, and who are here to listen, Professor Thomas. The broader theme of this conference is agnotological context, disciplinary practices of social sciences, and policy frames. On behalf of the Center for Adivasi Research and Development, I extend my profound gratitude to Professor Dr. Sanjay Kumar Nayak, respected Vice Chancellor, Reliance University, Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, respected Director, Indian Institute of Management, and Professor Dr. Sarath Kumar Palita, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha. The convener of this largest virtual conference, eminent Indian historian, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent policy activist, writer, and philanthropist, Mr. Charudat Panigrahiji. The main outcome of this conference is to come up with the national and international framework for the education system in future. The crux of this conference will be the use of digital technologies such as artificial intelligence and augmented reality, also virtual reality, that is being increasingly adopted after the outbreak of COVID-19. We hope this conference would help students, faculties, researchers, and to expand their mental horizon and help education system to adopt the best in the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, the Center for Adivasi Research and Development is a leading research-oriented institution promoting ethnographic, empirical, and evidence-based research for engaging and addressing the challenges that 21st century globe is facing today. The prime agenda of this institution is to come up with potential policy solutions for social change while believing in the idea of 3D, that means debate, dialogue, and discussion, and E3, expertise, experiencing, and education. The institution focuses on marginalized communities and work for their livelihood to protect the nature, culture, language, and identity in particular. The age of modernity had witnessed that change is the only constant phenomena for the societal purpose to enhance knowledge. Our information work for them is methodical and avoid paradoxically framework which is neglected so many centuries from theories to become practice. The center sincerely believes in the concept of social marketing, which is seriously looking for non-profit marketing and builds new social entrepreneurship for check and balance mechanism to glorify generations to come. The Center for Adivasi Research and Development come to serve with the holistic approach of critical thinking in education and also to fill the gaps and to plan accordingly for the voiceless communities, for beneficiaries, direct in self-reflecting societies. Dear friends, in today's afternoon, we have with us one of the finest brain of the 21st century and a very fine communication professor, Professor Pradip Thomas. Professor Pradip Ninan Thomas is an internationally recognized scholar and academic and is currently based at the School of Communication and Arts at University of Queensland, Australia. He has published widely in areas including communication and social change, the political economy of communication, media and religion, and Indian media. He has published in the world's top-ranked journal, including the Journal of Communication, Media, Culture and Society, the International Communications Gazette, the International Journal of Communication, Media, Culture and Society, the International Communication Gazette, the International Journal of Communication, and the European Journal of Communication, along with key Indian journals such as the Economic and Political Weekly. He sits on the numerous editorial boards and an associate editor of International Communication Gazette. He is known specifically for his attempts to expand redrew and renew theory in communication and social change. And his many writings have introduced both theorists such as E.P. Thompson and Raymond Williams, and concepts such as continuous action from social movement studies to communication and social change theory. He has previously published a trilogy of Indian media with Sage, and his forthcoming publications, including a study of telecommunication history in India. He is currently a co-editor of the book series, The Palgrave Studies on Communication and Social Change. As a former vice president of the International Association for Media and Communication Research, he is a well-known academic on the international circuit. His work have been widely referenced, cited, and used as text in communication-related courses throughout the world. Apart from writing, research, and teaching, Professor Pradip Thomas is keenly interested in natural history and bushwalking, and and is an amateur photographer and a music fan. In today's discussion, Professor Thomas will deliver his talk on making sense of digital India, a political economy perspective. Now, without taking much time, I would like to invite Professor Thomas to initiate his talk. Over to you, Professor Thomas.
Thank you, Professor Dash, for that very generous introduction. I think that is, you've kind of covered a lot of what I've done, and I'm grateful for what you've said. What I'll do in a moment is share my screen. I don't have too many slides to share, but I'm going to share a few things and I'm going to begin my presentation right now. So one of the traditions that we have in the Australia and New Zealand region, in the context of formal openings and events, is an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land, right? And this is done as part. This is something that we do, ordinarily, in the context of any event, for example, at the University of Queensland. So I thought I'd begin today by acknowledging the First Nation Adivasi communities in India, whose lands I was born in and where my parents are buried, right? And I would also like to acknowledge their knowledges, their cultures, their ways of life. I think absolutely critical to the ecological and human futures of India, right? So I think it's important that we ponder on the enormous contributions made by the Adivasi community to India as a country and to the world, and to take that seriously. I'd also like to thank the Center for Adivasi Research and Development and the director, Dr. Bikram Keshwari Jena, for inviting me to contribute to this series of talks on the gaps between social theory and practice. So one of the interesting things, when I was kind of working on this particular presentation is I had not previously come across the term agnotology, okay, until Bikram provided a very fulsome explanation of what it meant. And it led to the realization that a lot of my writings have indeed been on the gaps between ideological promise and institutional performance. And it's often that, institutional performance is hidden under a lot of rhetoric, especially in the context of India. We have things like, digital Acche Din and India shining and all these kinds of rhetorical flourishes, right? And what I've tried to do in my career in terms of, my academic career, in terms of my research, is I've kind of explored the gaps between, the ideological promise and institutional performance in India. And so what I'd like to do in the next couple of minutes is to share a few observations on the the political economy of digital India. And to a large extent, this is based on my writings, and in particular, a book that I wrote in 2019 called The Politics of Digital India. But let me just begin with a bit of background. My journey as a media scholar began in the 1980s, early 1980s, when I did my master's and my PhD at the now defunct Center for Mass Communications Research at the University of Leicester in England. So at that time in England, there were two broad schools of thought, critical thought in terms of the media and communications. There was one school of thought associated with the school that I was at, and there were two very important scholars who were in a sense, my mentors, Peter Golding and Graham Murdoch, who pioneered the critical understanding of media and a kind of critical political economy kind of approach. At the same time, there was another school, an equally famous school. It's called the Birmingham School. And that was led by a very famous cultural theorist by the name of Stuart Hall. And his center was called the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. In his center, the focus was on culture, right, rather than political economy, right? But it was also kind of a critical approach to understanding and culture, right? I think, broadly speaking, the political economy tradition has dealt with institutions, structures, and in the 1960s, for example, there was a well-known scholar by the name of Herb Schiller, who was an American who explored the power of American telecommunications companies in the 60s, the hegemonic power of telecommunications companies, right? And of course, many of these political economy tradition has explored, the kind of the power of media corporations, for example, right, to set agendas, and especially reinforce dominant political agendas, as has happened over the last couple of years. Like if you look at, for example, the power of a Rupert Murdoch, who owns News Corporation, he's got the kind of owns Fox News, etc. in the US. He's got the power to set agendas, right? And that's an incredible power, because most people don't have that kind of power, right? Now, of course, today I think while there used to be a lot of differences between the political economy tradition and the cultural studies tradition, today I think there's a realization that there needs to be an integrated approach to understanding the media, that an integrated approach that deals with both political economy and culture, right? And I think it's especially important in the context of today's world, a world that is, in a world that is saturated with social media, that we absolutely look at the consumption side of the media, right? What people do as they consume the media, right? And the kinds of effective socialities that are there in the context of today's platform economy, right? So from very early on, the political economy tradition has provided a scaffolding for me to understand all sorts of realities, right? So I work on, of course, I do work a lot on the media in India, and of course use that scaffolding, but I've also worked on issues around religion, for example, media and religion. Not only Christianity that I've looked at, but also Hinduism. And I also looked at things like communications and social change, right? All these I've looked at in the context of this kind of political economy lens. So what is kind of involved in a political economy kind of analysis of communications? And I think one of the key things with the political economy tradition is that they tend to kind of deal with the media in context. They take the context very seriously, right? You decenter the media to understand it better, right? You understand the media and all the influences. So for example, if you were to study the media in India, you'd look at the dominant power of politics to shape the media, the power of the owners of the media, the power of owners to set agendas, and so on and so forth, right? So you look at the media in context. You look at the media in the context of the dominant kind of political economy, right? So I think people have kind of argued about, what is at the core of the political economy tradition. And I think there's a well-known scholar by the name of Vincent Mosco, who has argued that, in the context of a critical political economy of communications, there are three things that one can look at. One is commodification of the media, the commodification of the media. In other words, how does kind of use value become transformed into exchange value, right? That is the whole issue of commodification, and I'll deal with that in a moment. And then the kind of the fact that the media have become global, the fact that the infrastructure of global communications, and thirdly, he's looked at the ways in which access and use are conditioned by one's own socioeconomic class, and in the case of India, identity markers such as caste and gender, etc. So you can see, one is commodification. The second thing, the fact that it's become globalized. Thirdly, access, right? The whole issue of access, which is a fundamental issue in the context of India, right? So let me, just deal with, for example, commodification at the moment. And the way to deal with this is by looking at the whole issue of religion in India, right? Now, commodification itself, and I've looked at commodification in the context of the kind of religious media market, right? I've looked at, for example, the Christian media market. But if you look at, for example, the Hindu media market, you'll see, today there are so many different types of online possibilities, right, for selling products that are associated with, forms of Hinduism, right? All sorts of forms of Hinduism. And what I'd like to, focus on here when you talk of commodification is, we need to distinguish between the kind of everyday items that are necessary, for example, in the context of a puja, right? You need flowers, those are not part of commodities, right? These are everyday things that are required. But it is, when a commodity, religious commodity becomes branded, when it becomes monetized, when it is sold for money, right? When you have a huge, for example, political economy around rudrakshas, right? Different grades of rudrakshas, etc., that is the kind of commodification, right? So you see this, really strongly in the context of what is called prosperity theology in the Christian circles, right? Where people, where branding is the basis for selling all sorts of products, right? So, everything under the sun is branded and sold as a religious product, right? And you can say that even in India, this is happening. For example, everything is sold as an Ayurvedic product, right? Even your biscuits have a bit of Ayurveda in it, right? Is Ayurvedic, let's say. And of course, the connection is between Ayurveda and purity, right? And so on and so forth. So commodification is a reality in today's circles. So for example, these are some pictures of online Hinduism, where you can do all sorts of pujas online, right? And there's a huge economy around this, different types of pujas, different types of possibilities. You can follow your own temples, etc., etc. There's a big money kind of economy around that, right? But I think the case of commodification in India is clearly there when you look at Baba Ramdev and Patanjali. I know that these, this is very, it's difficult to see the text here. But if you look at Baba Ramdev and Patanjali as an empire, right? You can see that he's made these kinds of distinctions between, he's made a case for his products being pure, Ayurvedic, pure, etc., etc. And yet, I think there are limits to how much you can call your toothpaste pure or your biscuit pure, right? Because it's got some Ayurvedic element in it. In other words, I have argued that this is a type of commodification that is happening in the context of Hinduism, right? But it is there in all religions. It's there in Islam, it's there in Buddhism, it's there in Christianity. So commodification is a big kind of issue. Okay, and here you have again some pictures of the Patanjali product. Everything under the sun is commodified. Remember that when he began his career, as a yoga expert, there were he sold a huge number of DVDs, right? Every cure under the sun, yoga for AIDS cure, yoga for this cure and that cure, etc., etc. That's also a form of commodification, because we know that while yoga has got some really wonderful strengths, it is not going to cure HIV/AIDS, right? So I think, these are the kinds of issues that are there when you talk of commodification. Okay, so that's just one thing that I wanted to kind of deal with. So commodification really deals with the issue of how use value, right? The use value of products become turned or transformed into exchange value. Everything becomes monetized. You pay for something, right? Which used to be available for free in the old days, right? And so on and so forth. Okay. Now, I think, like I said earlier, one of the key approaches to key assumptions related to the political economy tradition is to kind of decenter the media to understand it better, right? And and that is extraordinarily important when you study any media anywhere in the world. Okay, in order to understand the media, you need to understand all the factors that impact on the media, right? And also you need to understand how the media in turn impacts on society, right? So you've got to study both. But there have been some really well-known political economists, and I just want to to highlight the fact that there was a very well-known scholar by the name of Dallas Smythe, and in the I think it was in the 60s or early 70s, he put forward the very provocative view that the media are not only involved in the production of commodities, but primarily involved in the production of audiences, right? So what Smythe argued was that, and I quote, "The work which audience members perform for the advertiser to whom they've been sold is learning to buy goods and to spend their income accordingly. Their work to create the demand for advertised goods, which is the purpose of the monopoly capitalist advertising." Now, this is a very prescient observation, okay? Because we now recognize that in the context of the creation of value in a transactional economy, like in the context of social media economies, right? That it is, fundamentally based on the monetizing of our socialities online, right? So we are, as users of social media, all of us, are, we are basically being sold to advertisers, right? Through the transactions that we do, we are being sold to advertisers, which is why, our social media, advertising is so specific, right? Because because we are being sold in so many different ways without even us knowing it, we are being sold to advertisers. But the key text that with respect to a critical political economy of communications, tradition, is a book by Marx and Engels, a very famous book that they wrote, called The German Ideology, in which they make this very interesting statement, and the statement goes like this, and I'm going to read it out. "The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The class which is the ruling material force in society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships. So insofar, therefore, as they rule as a class and determine the extent, the compass of an epoch, they do this also as thinkers, as producers of ideas, and regulate the production and distribution of ideas of their age. Thus, their ideas are the ruling ideas of the epoch." And that is a very fundamental text that the critical political economists use, right? So if you look at, for example, media owners, right, throughout the world, whether it's the Ambanis in India, or if you look at Murdoch in the US, or whatever, they are actually sitting on top of massive resources. And those resources are pretty scarce, meaning that you and I don't own media. They own the media. And they can set agendas because of the fact that they own the media, right? So I think, it's important that we kind of understand media power. And in the political economy tradition, the media power of, say, a Rupert Murdoch is very different from the power that I have or you have, right? Because of the fact that, with Rupert Murdoch, he not only owns global newspapers, he owns cable television, he owns terrestrial television, he owns Hollywood studios, the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, et cetera. Companies like MySpace, the film industry, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And Now we can also look at, media, the owners of the media and media concentration in the context of India. You look, for example, at the at the power of someone like Ambani, right? Mukesh Ambani. I think Mukesh Ambani's position is even stronger compared to Murdoch, given the fact that he's not only involved in the control of digital media, but he's also, fundamentally involved in, in kind of changing the telecoms market, right? But he's also at the same time, he's got massive power in terms of his involvement in petrochemicals and retail, and of course he knows how to deal with every ruling power in India, right? And that is one of his strengths, right? But even when you look at, for example, something like Reliance Jio, right? And you have to understand Reliance Jio in context, right? Because of the fact that it plays, it plays a central role in the provisioning of infrastructure and devices that are key to the Digital India initiative, right? But also, I think we need to seriously consider the fact that the reason why Reliance Jio has been very successful is because they've been able to get the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of India on their side. They've been given very special dispensations, and which led to this kind of pricing war that led to, for example, 9 players in the telecoms field in 2015 becoming 3 in 2018. Okay, but the reality is, when you look at the power of these telecommunications companies in India, these 3 big companies, we have to also realize that it's not a happy story in some ways, right? The fact remains that the telecommunications industry in India is one of the most indebted sectors in India. In 2018, the 3 companies, Bharti Airtel, Vodafone Idea, and Jio, had a cumulative debt of $75 billion, right? That is about 500,000 crores of rupees that were in debt, but only 27.6 billion in revenues. In other words, 180,000 crores in revenues. Yeah, that is a kind of reality that we have today, and that's has to be taken very seriously in the context of dealing with the media. So one of the things with respect to with the understanding the media in India, or for that matter, anywhere else in the world, is understanding the role of the private sector, right? And in the context of India, especially the role of the private sector in the context of things like Digital India, right? And you can ask such questions. Who are they? What are the kind of key institutional drivers behind ICT for D projects? What are their motivations? What is the kind of nature of the investments? What are the kinds of partnerships that are there? Who makes policy when it comes to ICT for D, right? With these large projects, related to Digital India, like Aadhaar, et cetera, the, Arogya Setu, all these types of, apps, et cetera, who makes policy with respect to those kinds of things? Who's in and out in the context of policy making? Who benefits from such policies, right? So I think it's very important that we, in the context of Digital India, looking at Digital India, we understand the beneficiaries of ICTs in development. Who are the beneficiaries? And usually the beneficiaries are big corporations. They're the ones who are providing the hardware and software. They're the ones who are making huge amounts of money. Who invests? Who sponsors? Why? Who gains from connectivity? What are the primary motivations that lead to connectivity? What are the conditions for access and use? Et cetera, right? So I think it's important that we take very seriously the role played by the private sector in the context of these large initiatives such as Digital India, because I think there's an argument that they're the ones who benefit the most from these types of projects, right? Because of the fact that the state tends to be one of the biggest investors in the digital, right? They have to buy their hardware and software from some companies, and the companies from whom they buy from are the ones who benefit the most in these kinds of, in the context of these types of large projects. Okay. So I think it's very important that in the context of India, it's important that we understand the kind of, the power of the media and the fact that, and media dominance, and balance it out with also an understanding of media resistance, right? So in the context of India, there are many traditions of media resistance from below. So grassroots media, community radio, these kinds of things that are trying to kind of balance the field, right? So we have a field where there's a lot of dominant media, but there is also and has always been space for alternatives. Right? In the old days, you had, for example, the theater as an alternative, the Indian People's Theatre Association in the old days, in the 40s and 50s, right? And then you had alternative newspapers and news magazines, women's magazines, etc., right? And today we have things like community radio, etc., etc. And so it's important to look at the traditions of resistance that is there in India as well, and that is also part of the political economy tradition. Now, I've kind of written about both the dominance as well as the resistance, and like Professor Dash had mentioned in the introduction, between 2010 and 2012, I wrote 3 books with Sage. One was on the political economy of communications. Then I dealt, with communication rights movements in India, and this includes, for example, things like the free and open source software movement, the community radio movement, the women in media movement, the right to information movement, of course, which has been a fundamentally important movement, and so on and so forth, right? So trying to balance an understanding of both dominance and resistance, right? And more recently, I worked on the politics of digital India, right? And over the last many years, I've kind of been exploring the digital from the early days of its inception. Looked at the role of the state, because the state plays a fundamentally important role, especially in the context of the history of computing in India, the history of satellite technologies in India. And of course, there was always that desire, especially in the 80s, to kind of indigenize Indian telecoms technology, for example. You had people like Sam Petroda and the C-Dot project. And of course, even today, we have those kinds of noises from government, right? The need to indigenize our the telecoms industry. And then, of course, the consequences of the liberalization of telecoms in the early 1990s, the privatization of these industries, and of course the slow but sure demise of the major public sector telecom industries like MTNL and BSNL. They've been marginalized, right, over the last couple of years, and the private players have taken over. And of course the arrival and eventual proliferation of the mobile phone industry, and then of course over the last couple of years, the political economy of major companies like Jio, Reliance, and the role played by civil society in the context of the free and open source software movement, especially in states like Kerala, right? And I think Assam has also had a commitment to public sector software. These are very interesting, I think, dimensions of what I'd call the ambivalent state. You can't say that India is the Indian state supports dominance always. There's sometimes and periodically you see the Indian state actually supporting some very interesting projects that are very liberatory, right? And so you can't. So fundamentally, I think when you deal with the state in the context of the political economy of communications, you've got to be broad-minded about the state, and you can't put the state into one basket and say the state is like this or like that. Usually, the state is very multidimensional, right? It has many facets, and those facets can be manifested in the types of projects that they support. Okay, and I think the key thing with respect to with understanding the political economy of communication, at least what I've tried to do, is to understand both the ambitions of India to become a knowledge superpower, but also its its commitment to what's called governmentality, meaning there are times when the Indian state can become the control state. It wants to control everything kind of stuff, right? And in the context of the digital, you see that, right? It's kind of emphasis on surveillance, and of course issues in various parts of India where the internet can be switched on and off if there are problems there, and so on and so forth. There you see the dominance of the state. At the same time, I've argued that there are many examples of the Indian state being broadly supportive of the interests of its public. Okay, so I think in order to understand both dominance and resistance, the dominant state as well as the kind of resistant state, the ambivalent state, you need to have that a political economy kind of based understanding, right? None of these stories can be described in black and white. Each has been shaped by multiple forces. And I think the Indian state is fundamentally important. I think you cannot deal with the digital in India without dealing with the state. And it's a very complex entity. And I found it really fascinating to deal with that complexity. And I think the story of the digital, I think, is imprinted by this complexity, right? And I find that really fascinating. So the political scientists, Suzanne and Lloyd Rudolph, in their book, The Pursuit of Lakshmi, has called, they termed the state in India as polymorphous, a creature of manifold forms and orientations. And that's the way I like to see the Indian state. It has various forms and orientations. Sometimes it can be very dominant. Other times it can be very supportive of the interests of the public. Like, for example, if you look at the right to information movement in India, which is supported by the state, it is an extraordinarily progressive right? And the state backed it up, right? Of course, it took a long time for the state to back it up, but they did eventually back it up. Okay. Now let me, spend a few kinds of minutes dealing with the kind of shaping of the digital Indian. What are the key factors that I have recognized are important to understanding the digital moment in India? And what is necessary? What are those kinds of factors that are necessary to for a political economy kind of based understanding of the information of the digital of communications in India? Firstly, of course, one can talk about the strong belief in India in technological leapfrogging, right? So if you look at, for example, this whole, especially over the last 20 or 30 years, this whole rhetoric about digitization, the cashless economy, et cetera, the transactional economy, it's all based on this belief that it is possible to leapfrog, to go from the agricultural way of production to the knowledge economy, right? The agricultural economy to the knowledge economy, right? That technology can be employed to change the habits of people, the attitudes of the people, the lives of the people, right? From traditional to modern, right? This is, of course, central to this kind of vision of digital India, right? That this can be done, this technological leapfrogging can be done. So if you look at, for example, the digitization of our welfare economy in India, and of course, projects such as, like Aadhaar and demonetization, each can be seen as footprints or footnotes in the country's ambitions to become a transactional economy based on the digital, right? It wants everybody, whether it's in an old lady in rural India to a modern individual sitting in maybe Bhubaneswar or Delhi, to all become part of this digital kind of framework, right? And I think, if you look at the history of technologies, all new technologies have been accompanied by this rhetoric, right? When television came, people thought that television is going to change society. We have the same kind of understanding in India too. ICTs will change everything, information, communication. Your mobile phone will change everything, right? Or the internet, access to the internet is going to change everything. But, that is not how life is, right? Just because you have access to the internet does not mean that, life is going to change for you, right? Gender relationships in India are not going to change because women are digitally empowered. You need to have strong policies, right? So this is where the technological leapfrogging has its limitations, the way I think, right? This understanding that technology can leapfrog, that you don't need to, that technology on its own will solve all your solutions, all your problems, right? This is a solution kind of thing. is, I think, highly problematic. Right? And in the context of India, we've always had that kind of thinking. Right? So at the same time, I think there is no denying the fact that the digital has become a common language in India, right? At every different level, right? It has been embraced by everybody, whether it's genetic information or e-government or whatever you want to call it. We've had some extraordinary success stories. For example, our satellite success story is massive, right? And a recent book that I've that just is in press at the moment, called the Information Infrastructures in India, the Long View, published by Oxford in 2022. There's a particular chapter on the satellite industry, which India's satellite industry is a huge success story. Right? There are very few examples of that from anywhere in the world. Right? And of course, the rollout of massive national e-government projects. Right? The rollout of mobile phones, for example. All these are massive success stories. But like I said, the mere introduction of a technology does not necessarily have to lead to massive social change, right? And of course, in the context of COVID-19, there is now a realization that, COVID-19 actually, highlighted the kinds of, the digital divide that is there in India. So, for example, I've read a lot of articles on students in rural India who did not have access to smartphones and the internet being left behind in the context of this kind of turn towards, online education because of COVID-19. Right? So there are those kinds of disparities, and I think there are those types of gaps, right? And there are some, there were some really difficult stories that came out of, say, UP and other places that were really affected by COVID-19, of people with smartphones being able to kind of access oxygen cylinders in certain hospitals and others who couldn't, right? All those kinds of demonstrated the fact that it's not just the technology. You might need the technology, but you also need to have other systems in place, right? You need to make sure that you have policies in place that are supportive of these technologies. I remember that a couple of years ago, when I was in Chennai, me and my sister-in-law had gone to visit a couple of communities there, and mainly Adivasi communities. And I was looking at, for example, their use of mobile phones. And it was fascinating that in some of the places that we went to, some of the villages that we went to, there was a lot of access. There was access to laptops, but there was no electricity, right? And these were the kinds of issues. So, for example, these kids, showed me their laptop that was, free laptops given by, at that time, I think, ADMK government, and they had this big free laptop scheme, but there was no electricity, right? And they were actually taking the electricity from grids, right? The grids that were not for their village, but for another village. So they used to go there and put the leads in and charge their laptops, through those kinds of manners, because their own village didn't have electricity, right? So that is one of the issues, right? You need to have, in the context of the digital India, you need to also invest in those local capacities. You need to invest in infrastructure, like regular supplies of electricity. You need to have, for example, software available in local languages. You need to have the supply of usable information. You need to have, people's voices need to be heard. You need to train people, invest in training so that people know how to deal and are able to adapt and modify technology, etc., etc. Those are very important, right? If you don't have those capacity building projects, then your ICT projects are going to be problematic. Right? Throughout the world, there's been a belief that if you go and give people laptops, their world is going to change. Right? It doesn't work that way. Right? If you don't have those capacity building, investments in capacity building, if you don't invest in infrastructure, etc., etc., your people are not going to be empowered, right? And this, for example of these young kids, who've got laptops but no electricity, really highlights the fact that you need to actually, support. You need to have those enabling environments, right? Supportive of of development, of the users of ICTs for development. So that's one example, right? And here's another photograph that I took, and this is again of a household, where because of episodic electricity flows, the refrigerator has been turned into a place where this kid keeps his books. Right? It's not used for cold water, but for books. Right? So these are the many lives of infrastructure in India, right? That given the fact that you don't have reliable electricity supplies, et cetera, some of these technologies cannot be used or used for other things, and that is something that needs to be taken seriously. So the first thing is technological leapfrogging. So when you talk of digital India, this whole issue of is technological leapfrogging going to work in a context in which we still have large numbers of people living in the rural economy, living on wage labor, on subsistence, they're living subsistence lives. How are we going to bring these people into this digital revolution kind of thing? These are big issues, right? Because in order to bring them in, we have to support them for they need to have a roof over their head, they need to have food to eat, they need to have all these other things. That's when the digital can make a difference. If they don't have that, then what's the point of the digital? As Bill Gates once famously said, you cannot eat a computer, right? So that is a reality. Right? You need to actually think of the enabling environments that supports the digital need. The second thing that I was very interested in when I was doing my work on the digital, especially the politics of digital India, is that there is a kind of internal politics in India that is involved in shaping the digital, right? And that internal politics is fascinating for me, right? So on the one hand, you have, you can deal with corporations, foreign income coming in, foreign direct investments coming in, et cetera. But you also have to deal with an internal politics. So, for example, in the context of the present government in India, and the family of the Sangh Parivar and the organizations that are supportive of it, the RSS, for example, the RSS's economic wing, which is the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, has played a very interesting role in limiting the full-blown economic liberalization that the BJP wanted to be involved in. Right? So the BJP's economic platform is very liberal, right? But it hasn't been able to do much in that area because of the fact that even internally, even within their groups, there are those who kind of have limited that agenda, and of course, especially in the context of the platform economy, organizations like the Swadeshi Jagran Manch has played a very important role in limiting what can be achieved in that space. Right? At the same time, you see in the context of the farm bills, the recent farm bills that have been, the pullback on the farm bills that happened a couple of years ago is a couple of days ago. It's very interesting it was very interesting to read that the RSS affiliated Bharatiya Kisan Sangh was opposed to those. So even within, internally there are lots of oppositions, right? And I think it's, when you look at, for example, the shaping of digital India, we need to think, you have to factor in, both, the policy making, et cetera, but also the oppositions, right? And the opposition can play a fundamentally important role in the shaping of these large digital projects, right? And of course, if you look at if you look at the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, they've played a very important role in limiting global e-commerce platforms, genetically modified foods. They've supported amendments to e-commerce that supports the rights of traders, service providers, and consumers who use digital platforms, et cetera, et cetera. So I find that kind of internal, the internal politics very, very fascinating. At the same time, I think these organizations are, support the digitization of the state. but within certain kind of boundaries. The third area that I want to deal with and that I've dealt with is the geopolitics of the digital. Right? So when you look at the, what is happening in the digital sphere in India, there are people who argue that this is an entirely Indian thing, right? It's Indian, this is India's ambitions to become a digital knowledge superpower, etc., etc. And while on the one hand that is true, I think it is necessary for us to deal with the fact that the shaping that is happening in India is also being, is also because of our relationship with other countries, right? Like our important trading partners like the USA, right? The USA has played a fundamentally important role in the kind of shaping of the digital India, right? So again, as a political economist of communications, I've dealt, for a long time with that relationship, which I found, personally speaking, a very problematic relationship, right? Because of the fact that the US has always been the more dominant partner in that relationship as a trade partner. Okay. So for example, if you look at the history of computing in India, right, or the history of satellites in India, you realize that one of the key sources for transfers of computing digital technologies, and of course, today, one of the main destinations for IT labor, key partner in India's investments in surveillance and defense, and of course, especially now in the context of China's ambitions in South Asia, it has been the USA. Right? The USA has been our partner over the last 50, 60 years, ever since independence, right? They've been a very strong partner in this space. But however, despite the fact that they've been a partner, it has been a very difficult partner to deal with, at least in my way of thinking, especially in the areas with respect to the transfers of technology. In supercomputing, for example, and satellites, they had major issues with the export of what they call dual-use technologies that can be used both for military purposes as well as civilian purposes. There were always fears in the 70s and 80s that India would pass on secrets to our most reliable partner, which was the USSR, right? And there was always that fear, with the result that the US always kind of balked at giving India, the technologies when we needed it the most, right? But it also had another kind of impact, right? Because the USA, kind of limited technology transfers in India, India's resolve to become indigenous, to indigenize their technologies, became all that more powerful, right? So in that sense, that relationship was good for India, right? Because India's resolve became stronger when, for example, the US denied India supercomputing, capabilities. The Indians manufactured this stuff themselves. Same thing is happening in the satellite space, right? Where they've, they relied on themselves, they've indigenized, they of course dealt with other partners such as folks in the EU and so on and so forth. Okay. So for example, one of the most famous US sanctions against the Indian Space Research Organization and its Russian supply company Glavkosmos was in 1992-94, when there were attempts to made to stop this company from supplying cryogenic engines to ISRO that were critical to the geosynchronous satellite launch vehicle, the GSLV launch vehicles, right? So these types of embargoes led to a lot of delays in India in the context of its own, commitment to building the GSLV satellite launch vehicle. And of course, in the more recent past, India has been, exploring the PSLV, which is the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, and they've been hugely successful. They've also, done, massively well in the area of PSLV. But they would have done all these things much earlier if the embargo had not been there, right? If the US embargo had not been there. And if you really look at what is happening in that relationship between the US and India, you realize that even today, there are lots of issues with respect to US partnership with, for example, ISRO, because of the fact that India had refused to sign what's called the Commercial Space Launch Agreement. This Commercial Space Launch Agreement basically enables US commercial launch prices to be, to become the kind of global pricing, right? And this is being contested by India, right? And of course, India has been hugely successful. And in 2016, for example, 96 out of the 104 satellites launched in February 2016 on PSLV 37 were from US companies, right? So we've been hugely successful, but at the same time, I think, this relationship with the US reminds us that US imperialism is alive and well. And I think it's extraordinarily important that those who work on a critical political economy of communications deals with that imperialism, because it does and can negatively impact on technology and the state of technology in countries like India. Okay, of course, another very famous example of US kind of, I would call it recalcitrance, was the fact that its refusal to share GPS data in the context of the confrontation between Pakistan and India at Kargil in 1999. This led to India investing in its own navigation system, the Indian Regional Navigation Satellite System, that became live in 2018, and that is used for terrestrial, aerial, and marine navigation, vehicle tracking, fleet management, disaster management, mapping, and geodetic data capture, visual and noise, voice navigation. So you can see that, because of the US, the fact that US contests India's technological, power, that contributes to Indian resolve to kind of indigenize their technologies and to create their own technologies, which I think in the long run is a good thing. Okay. Furthermore, I think what the US has done is they've used what's called their kind of Section 301 sanctions. Their US trade representative has always singled out India for all sorts of reasons, right? For being bad trade allies when it comes to intellectual property, et cetera, and the sanctions, sanctions are there because of the fact that India produces generic drugs. We limit software patents. We've taken a very protectionist stance against IT labor. All these things, are kind of contested by the US, right? So I think what I'm trying to say is that any account of the digital India needs to actually take the digital in its in the context of all the factors that impact on the digital, right? And it can't be seen purely from within India. It needs to be seen in the context of its influences from the outside, the imperatives of global trade, and especially countries like the USA. Okay, so I think when I look at the relationship with the USA, I've always believed that it's been one-sided. US has always been the dominant partner, and of course, most recently in the context of India levying the kind of Google tax, the equalization levy, there's been a lot of criticisms of the equalization levy from the US government, and there was until recently a Section 301 kind of investigation in the context of the equalization levy, because the US have argued that the equalization levy goes against the interests of US corporations like Google, Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. But I think, that's another area that needs to be looked at. Fourthly, I think, and like I mentioned earlier, when you deal with the political economy of communications, you really have to deal with that ambivalent state, right? That is India. It is tempting to treat the Indian state in black and white terms. It's a lot more complicated. And so, for example, the 3 chapters in the book on the first 3 chapters in the book on the politics of digital India, I've dealt with the control state, right? And this control, it's always been there. Like, for example, if you look at the history of broadcasting in India, the state has always wanted to control broadcasting. Okay, and today, of course, in the context of digital India, there's a tendency for the state to also kind of continue trying to kind of control the flows of information, right? And of course use outdated laws like our 1887 or whatever telecommunications laws as the basis for this kind of control. Right? And so this is evident, right? You have issues with censorship, and the many kind of governmentality projects that are there, etc., etc. It's pretty clear that there is that tendency for the government to control. But in the second section of the book, I deal with the state's support for what can be considered broadly progressive policies. For example, that includes in the key role played by India at the World Intellectual Property Organization's Treaty for the Visually Impaired, right? The Marrakesh Treaty. And it's fascinating that that the Indian government played a very important role there, and Indian civil society also played a very important role in the creation of the establishment of that particular treaty. We all know that people with visual impairments face what's called a book famine, right? Only 5% of the world's books are actually translated, available in languages that the visually impaired can access, right? And in countries like India, it's like 1 or 2%. It's ridiculous. Now, in the old days, before this particular treaty came into being, in order for a visually impaired to get access to a particular or translate something into Braille or whatever, they had to go through lots of hoops, right? And more often than not, the publishing companies didn't give them access. Right? But the Marrakesh Treaty, and before that, the amendments to the Copyright Treaty in India enabled people with visual impairments to not have to go and take permissions, right, from copyright holders. If they want to translate a book into Braille, they can go and do it now without taking permissions, and that is a huge victory for the visually impaired, right? And I think the Indian government played a fundamentally important role in the context of that change. And like I said, even before the Marrakesh Treaty, the Indian government amended its Copyright Bill 2012, and that now so copyright people with visual impairments do not have to compensate the rights holders for the uses of copyrighted material, right? And of course, the Indian government has also been very critical of global internet governance, of the present system of multi-stakeholderism. All these are very important, right? Extraordinarily important, and that shows the kind of, what should I say, the ambivalent state, right? The fact that the state can also resist dominant powers. Okay. And another example of the proactive state is the attempt by the Indian government to tax platforms, especially Google, Facebook, etc., and the equalization levy, right? The Google tax. Again, I think really important that the Indian government did this because these big companies were not paying taxes, right, or paying limited number of limited taxes. Right? And you can see all this as as a move by the Indian state to kind of to equalize the paying of taxes, right? So that all corporates pay similar kinds of taxes. Right? So I just want to add the fact that I think in the context of India, one of the big issues in India is the need for us to understand digital access as a human right and a public good, right? And one of the issues with the digital here is that it's funny that when you deal with the digital is so very different from other resources and commodities, right? Because the digital is not a scarce resource, right? From economics, we learn about rival and non-rivalrous resources. Right? A rivalrous resource is like, for example, you want to eat a biscuit, you buy a packet of biscuits, you eat it, and if you want to eat more, you're going to buy one more packet of biscuits. Right? That's how it is. But a non-rivalrous resource is like the digital. Right? You can, like for example, this particular presentation can be watched by anyone who's connected in the world, right? So your consumption and mine of this particular presentation does not deplete it in any way. It's a non-rivalrous resource. Right? So if you look at the digital in that kind of sense, it can be you can have strong government policies that push it to become a public good. For example, in the US today, there is strong, bipartisan support to break up the big e-commerce platforms like Amazon and social media platforms like Facebook, because they say, look, these things they're now acting like public utilities. They become an essential resource, like water, like cooking gas, etc., and they need to be regulated as public utilities. And that kind of thinking is important in the context of a country like India, where there are vast disparities in terms of who has access to the digital. This is where I think the government can play a role in dealing with the digital in that kind of more progressive way, not as a rivalrous resource, but as a non-rivalrous resource. Right? To use the digital as something akin to a public good, right? A public good that is open to everybody. It's like the signals of All India Radio and Doordarshan that goes to everybody, right? It should be like that, right? That's how it should be. So I think these are the kinds of things that can be done. And what's very interesting is over the last couple of years, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, there have been some other developments in the context of the digital that are broadly progressive. One is, of course, the right to repair movement. And of course, this has become very strong after, and it's going all over the world. And this is the right to repair digital products, right? For a long time, big companies like Apple, etc., would not allow a third party to repair their products. Right? Today, the right to repair movement has pushed them to understand that this can no longer be the case, that people should be able to repair their own products, right? Because of the fact that these have become so important. These types of products have become very important in our everyday lives. Okay. So finally, I think that there is a kind of tendency for critical political economists of communications to be very pessimistic about the economy, about politics, etc., and so on and so forth. So that is the reality. To some extent, this pessimism is well-founded, considering the scale of communication deficits in any country, including India. Where we see major information enclosures, the extraordinary overreach of the state when it comes to certain digital policies, in enforcing digital censorship, digital surveillance, and carte blanche support for the private sector as opposed to civil society. These kinds of things are happening in India. And I think it's also sad to see in some ways that most media are very pliant supporters of the government, right? They're not critical of the government. And so I think it's important that we deal with that state corporate nexus when it comes to the media, communications, the digital. But I think I think there are some wonderful exceptions, right? For example, in the community radio movement, you see some wonderful examples of resistance from below. Like, for example, the radio station Sangam Radio in Hyderabad, that is organized by the Deccan Development Society, where you see Dalit women, for example, playing a critical role in using radio for their own empowerment and the empowerment of their communities. And that is the interesting thing about India. While I deal with the digital, it was V.S. Naipaul, the Indian writer, Indian origin writer, who once described India as a land of 1 million mutinies. Right? Despite all the exercise of power by the state, you have so many different types of resistances that are difficult to control by the state. Right? And that is one of the strengths of India. Right? And I think this is going to be kind of key to how the Indian state, how the digital in India develops. If you want an equitable Indian, the development of the digital in India, then you need to have those types of resources. You have what are called these Jugad kind of DIY cultures, right? Grassroots movements in the informal sector that are also playing a role in democratizing the digital. Right? These are all important. And I think finally, in terms of my comments, I think the way I see critical political economy of communications, you need to deal with media dominance and digital dominance, but you also need to deal with digital resistance. I've been recently doing work on community networks. So you have community radio, but in different parts of the world, there are local communities now organizing their own internet, and organizing their own digital access, organizing their own mobile phones, etc., etc. Those are fundamentally important. If people, if you really believe in the value of access in digital India, then you have to kind of democratize people's access. Enable people to create their own environments, right? To have control of their own environments, so that they can create digital access that is based on their needs, rather than based on impositions from above. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll wait for some questions. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your very insightful and wonderful delivery, sir. Now I would like to request Dr. Sapan Bag to go for a quick comment, then we'll question and answer session with sir.
Hello. Good evening to one and all in
Yes,
India.
please.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay. Great. So first of all, it's really very privilege and honor to have Professor Thomas with us, and it was absolutely enchanting and enlightening to hear the talk from Professor Thomas. And thank you so much, Pradip Thomas sir, for giving
My
us
pleasure.
a very holistic and global perspective by marking our country's digital journey, I would say, right?
Yeah.
And if I look at the presentation that you have given, so what I could analyze is, and I could divide it in two segments. The first one is, in your first part, you have highlighted the country's digital positioning, I would say, at global level, right? And you have also given a sort of reflection on our positioning and our dealing with international communities, particularly the US and other advanced countries. And in the second part, you have also highlighted the interstate disparities and the different aspects that to a large extent are favoring or not favoring the policy level decisions, and also the various propositions that somehow is contributing to the journey that we are talking about as far as the digital India is concerned, right?
Yeah.
Now, so so sir, there are two things that I would like to highlight, and in fact I would like you to respond on that. As we all know that demographically India is such a land where we will find diversity as its genetic sort of thing, right? It is inborn in nature as far as Indian demography is concerned. And particularly when we look at the other population, particularly the tribal population, which also constitutes and contributes to a great extent, not only India's positioning at global level, but also India's rich cultural tradition and things. And
Absolutely.
in this entire journey of digital India, somewhere, don't we think that the tribal peoples are always at the at the receiving end, who are being somehow neglected, deprived of sort of things? Because why I'm saying, because today early in the morning I was going through one of the news article in the newspaper, local newspaper, and it has been categorically mentioned, and it's an assembly question where the minister has given a fact that during this pandemic, hardly at somewhere around nearly 10% of children only could have access to different means of online education, that was either by provided by Doordarshan or by YouTube or some other kind of media for ensuring education during this pandemic through online mode. This is one part. This is in case of Orissa. The second part is, as we all see, that the policy level dialogue that happens in India has always been confronted with lots of debates, discussion, and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at the recent development of India, I am sure that you must be having that note as well, when there is a struggle between the government from Tamil Nadu and India as far as the National Education Policy 2020 is concerned, where they are have some sort of reservation. So this also gives us a proposition that there is always an interstate disparity in terms of policy level dialogues, right?
Yep.
So this is also another booster, don't you think, that marks or that hindrances countries' progress toward digital journey? And how do we combat this? The last one that I would say, you have rightly mentioned, sir, that 5% of books globally accessible by visually impaired children, if I'm correct in my statistics that you gave.
Yeah.
What about the 95% people, right?
Yeah.
And this is not the only area of concern. At the same time, if again I come back to tribal people where they don't have script, but they do have language, right? And are we also not somewhere intentionally or unintentionally creating a sort of gap by in the name of digital divide? If so, how to address this, given the fact that India again has to position itself at the global level? So this would be my reflection, and I hope we will get some sort of enlightenment from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very interesting and very interesting sets of questions and complex questions as well. So I'll try and answer. I'm not too sure whether it will answer your questions fully. But let me begin with the kind of the digital divides that are there with respect to India's so-called tribal populations, right? I teach a course on what's called community informatics. And community informatics is about communities using new technologies, digital technologies, etc. And one of the case studies that I use is of indigenous communities in Mexico, right? Who over the last 5 or 6 years have begun, have begun investing in their own capabilities, and create and now have created their own, internet facilities, mobile phone facilities. They've been trained, they've got their own capacities in terms of barefoot engineers, all these kinds of things that have strengthened local communities, local tribal communities. They strongly believe in autonomy and independence, right? So that's where they begin from. So in other words, the fact that they've created all this digital stuff, digital footprint, is based on what they want and what they desire, what they need, right? That is, I think, is very critical in a country like India. We have, huge number of so-called tribal groups in the length and breadth of India, right? What kind of autonomy do we give them, right? Do they need that autonomy? In my way of thinking, they need, absolutely. If they're going to survive India's, this kind of hyper-economic development, they need to strengthen their own independence and create a kind of development that is based on their own needs. That is fundamentally important. How do we do that? Is there possibility? Are there spaces for that in India? And is it worth fighting for that? I think it's really worth fighting for that. The fact, and of course, Odisha is a good example of that, right? You've had all sorts of issues with communities because of mining, this, that, all the rest of it. I'm aware of it. Right? To what extent are these communities strong enough to protect their own interests? Right? Not only their economic interests, not only their livelihoods interests, but also their digital interests. Right? So to me, that is absolutely fundamental. Right? And then, of course, how do you deal with the kind of interstate disparities that are there? I think India is a federal, it's a federal system. Right? The states have got their own autonomy to a certain extent, right? They don't have full autonomy, but they have autonomy with certain things, and I think that's important. Right? Otherwise, what can happen is that you have the central government pushing down all policies, and that's probably not a good thing, right? So I think that diversity needs to remain. That structure that the Constitution provides is actually fundamentally important. But more important than the interstate disparities, I think, is how do we kind of strengthen the digital at a local level, right? And how can we have some fresh thinking with respect to that? Because of the fact that I think it's important for the government to actually trust people. Trust is most important. If the government trusts people, then they will not have a problem with allocating, say, frequencies, right? Without NGOs having to go through so many hoops to get a frequency, right? As is the case today in the community radio movement. If you want a license, you've got to, go to the home minister, this minister, that minister, to get all these clearances before you get your frequency. These, I think, are difficult things. And I think if the government trusts its communities, then there are a lot more possibilities for development in the country. And I think that is absolutely fundamentally important in the context of digital, right? Because digital is something that you have to create based on your own needs, right? And if you can create local capacities, train young men and women to set up their digital initiatives, all these kinds of things, the country is going to do really, really well, and the people are going to do really well, right? There won't be any of these kinds of disparities. There are disparities because we don't have, there are kind of limited, limited opportunities for people to become part of this digital revolution, right? There are very few opportunities. The opportunities are all imposed. They don't come from below, right? And I strongly believe that it must come from below. Okay.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coining this word trust. It's truly a very heart touching when we hear this word, but it is at the same time same level of difficulty is there when we talk about the implementation of this particular word touch. When we translate the policy into practice, not touching the heart of the people and keeping this trust intact with this policy framework is absolutely a very Herculean task kind of Herculean kind of task.
I agree completely. I mean, if you look at the community radio movement, if you look at the history of the community radio movement, and this is something I've followed over the many years, if you look at its inception and how it began, the belief was that community radio would be completely independent and would support local communities. Today, you're in a situation where there's been the kind of NGOization of the community radio movement. There's been, state interference in the community radio movement, and so on and so forth, right? So what has happened is that initial belief, in community radio making a difference to local communities is no longer there. I mean, it is there in certain communities. You have, like I said, Deccan Development Society in Hyderabad, Radio Sangam, or Gurgaon Ki Awaz in Gurgaon in Delhi. Those kinds of radio stations have done some amazing work, right, with local communities. But there are very few examples of that because of the fact that, there's been that kind of, what should I say, a difference between, ideological promise and institutional performance, right? And so I completely agree that this is a problem. But I think, if we really want to, if we are serious about, digital empowerment, communities being empowered, etc., we simply have to begin from where people are, right? That is, I think, the strength of the digital, right? That is where the strength of the digital can be, realized in a full kind of way.
True. Thank you so much, Professor Thomas. My last point of submission, again, as you have worked so extensively across the globe and you have a large expertise, my only thing is that, is there any case study or is there any initiative in any part of the globe where people have started digitizing the transcript or the dialect of this tribal people as far as this digitization of media is concerned? Like, there are several dialects that are at the verge of extinction, and at the same time they do have their own indigenous knowledge which is dying at the end of their language, or let's say when their community is in danger, right? So is there any case study of digitizing this cultural heritage and the linguistic backdrop, so that this could be one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a fundamentally important question. I mean, I believe that there are lots of examples. Australia's got lots of examples of that. New Zealand has examples, and of course from Canada there are lots of examples of indigenous people, and the digitizing of their knowledges and things, right? And this is again an extraordinarily important extraordinarily important thing that we need to deal with. And one of my criticisms of the traditional indigenous kind of knowledge library, digital knowledge library in India, is the fact that it's only, it only deals with those, the kind of dominant traditions, right? It doesn't deal with the kind of smaller traditions associated with indigenous communities, right? The extensive, ethnobotanical knowledge that they have on flora and fauna, et cetera, medicinal knowledge, all these things, and of course, their own language, all these kind of things are extraordinarily important. Language, language diversity and biodiversity are interrelated. You probably know that, right? When languages die out, you also lose out on biodiversity, right? Because languages name the world into existence. So every tribal community has its language. That language names the environment, right? When that language goes, our knowledge of that, not only of that language, but of all the biodiversity also disappears, right? This is why I think, it is really fundamentally important that indigenous languages are protected, maintained, supported, because it is connected to biodiversity.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Saban. Sir, this is a question from Dr. Subham Das. How you look at food alternation and commodification as well as branding of unhealthy foods in the media through advertisements, so far as the Marxist political economy approach is concerned?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very difficult thing to deal with because there's so much of it in India. Yeah, India has got the largest media market in the world, one of the largest media markets, and it is, heavily based on advertising. So all sorts of products are being peddled online, and so it's a, I think, it's a difficult thing to deal with because all these channels are heavily indebted to advertising. Right? Advertising is what helps them with their revenues, right? It's not the subscription revenues that is the basis for many of these companies. It's advertising revenues, right? So they're dependent on advertising. So if advertising shuts down, many of these companies will also shut down, right? So it's an interesting question, but a difficult question, because of the fact that it's very difficult to get out of this commodified system. Right? So I think the only way to deal with this is to have media diversity. You have as many different types of media as possible, right? So that the media alternatives balance out these kind of dominant media institutions that are based on advertising, right? So the advertising model is not the only model. We know that. And I think we need to have kind of more investments in other types of models, right? So that there is some kind of balance within the system, right? I think the reality today, of course, is that, if you look at the Indian, cable and, basically television environment, it is a massive television environment, right? If you look at, for example, religious television itself, I think there are 50 or 60 channels devoted to religion, right? And many of them are commodified. Much of them is commodified, right? So I think the only way to deal with this is to actually provide investments for alternatives.
And this is my, I would love to ask. There's one question from Dr. from audience side. What is digital literacy and is it possible to digital support in Indian regional languages to empower the Indian citizens?
Yeah, I think, okay, let me go back to that last one. I could read it better now. Food adulteration and commodification, as well as branding of unhealthy foods. Yeah, I mean, this really depends on, strong state policies, right? You need to have you need to be able to have advertising policy, advertising regulation, right? If you have strong regulation, then you can deal with these kinds of issues. If you have weak regulation with respect to advertising policy, then anything goes, right? You can push any kind of thing, unhealthy foods, etc., right? So I think at the end of the day, in a country like India, you need to have really strong advertising policies, right? with sanctions linked to it and so on and so forth, right? If people actually break those policies, then you should be able to sanction them. But, is the government willing to do that? Is the issue, right? Is the big one. Universal digital literacy, I think so. I think, one of the big success stories in India is that, in early days of television, there was a belief that, with television, India is going to completely lose out on all its regional languages, that everything will be in English, right? That has never happened, right? Despite the fact that you have an English footprint in television, today, the vast majority of these channels are vernacular channels, right? And that is a reality, right? So if this is the case, I think it is possible to provide digital services in Indian regional languages. That's not an issue at all. I think, there are, in India, there's lots of developments of regional software, language-based software in each of the different states. And these are empowering in themselves. There are also, for example, in some states like Kerala, there has been investments in software for the visually impaired, and so on and so forth, right? So you do have lots of investments in this area, and it's a matter of it's a matter of more investment, intentional investments in the kind of in digitization in local languages, right? Again, this is both a federal government commitment as well as state government commitment, right? And I think today you have state government commitment with respect to regional language provisioning, and digital services. So I think it's there, right? I think maybe there's a case to be made for more investments in that area.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, what is your observations during the LPG model and ICT revolution? How do you look at the best things possible for the movements as concerned? The digital movements or the social movements, or you rightly mentioned in your work, though you are working a lot in natural history. How you look at the revelation about particular the LPG model imposed on us in terms of ICT? How do you look these issues?
Which model is this, Bikram? Which model is this? The LPG model?
LPG model and ICT, sir. Information Communication and Technology.
Yeah. What is the LPG one? What does LPG stand for?
Liberalization, privatization, and globalization.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, see, I think, on the one hand, you have, the state has the responsibility to digitize the nation, right? That is their responsibility. They have to do it. There's no question. The Indian government has been doing these types of investments, and that is, I think that is their, that is their mandate. They have to do it. There's no question. The question for me is whether, they also provide spaces for, ICTs to develop from the bottom up, from the grassroots, right? And to what extent they allow that, right? And I think this goes back to that issue of trust that I mentioned earlier. If you don't trust people to develop their own technologies, then you're going to always impose things, right? You only have one paradigm, one development paradigm, that's top down, right? It's always top down. So the government is there as some kind of a paternal figure that always provides ICTs for everybody in the country, national ICTs, etc. And that's, on the one hand, that's important. But at the same time, there has to be the spaces where, local people can invest in their own technologies, right? And that is when you need to have that balance, because, okay, at the end of the day, I think it is impossible for the government to create a national system that is accessible for everybody. It is impossible, right? Despite the fact that the government has huge amounts of resources, billions of dollars, etc., etc., it is an impossible thing for them to do this on a scale in a country with 1.3 billion people. It is very difficult, unless you are a country like China, right? And of course, China is a different type of system, is an authoritarian system, and you have to basically follow the rules, right? There's no question. For example, in India, like the previous question, we have many states. There are many disparities between the federal government and the states. The states can do their own thing. So in that context, it is very difficult for them to create a nationwide system that works perfectly, where everybody has got access, right? Perfect access. That is impossible. It's not, it's not possible. I think, there has to be that realization that, the digital only works best when it's, based on local needs, and that is when empowerment can happen, right? And so in my teaching of community informatics, I realized that there are now fascinating examples of tribal groups and indigenous people using the digital in so many different, very exciting ways. Like, for example, GPS, using a digital, like GPS by indigenous people to kind of chart out their lands, for example, right? In other words, to create maps of the lands that belong to them, right? And these are extraordinarily important in many parts of the world because its land is being taken off by the corporations, by the state, et cetera, right? So you do have those types of empowering uses of technologies. And the question for me always is, India is, like Naipaul said, is a land of a million mutinies. When are we going to see more of, these kinds of more, what should I say, creative, innovative uses of technologies at a local level, right? And why shouldn't we be seeing it now? Because it's happening everywhere else in the world. When things are, when indigenous people are digitizing their own, through their own involvement in so many different types of projects in different parts of the world, I can't see why that should not be the case in India. It should be the case in India, right? So,
thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And sir, my last question for you today. Sir, what is your observations for the political economy as concerned, for the knowledge practitioners as concerned? How far is concerned this political economy of knowledge producers or the knowledge makers?
Can you explain that again, Vikram?
Sir, what is the political economy of knowledge producers for this globe? And what is the political economy for the knowledge makers in terms of information and technology? They are almost propagating this theory of alternative model for the development in the seek of knowledge, and very co-relation with this knowledge and information. The paradigm shifting culture of education is different from one state to another state. What is your observation, sir?
Yeah, this is okay. This is also part of that federal system that is India, right? You have, different, states having different priorities when it comes to education, right? Again, I think it's going to be based on local needs. How do you develop ICT policies that are, that fulfill the promises that you made to your electorate when you were elected, right? And that is going to differ from state to state. So I think, we have to, in the context of India, that, the relationship between the federal system and the state system is absolutely critical, right? Absolutely fundamentally important. And this is, again, this adds another level of complexity to dealing with the digital. So for example, I have not dealt with that complexity, but that, to me, this is an example of a further layer of complexity, right? You cannot only deal with the digital in relationship to the state, that is India. You've got to deal with the digital in the context of all the other states that make up India, right? You have how many, 28 states or something that make up India, right? Each state has a different digital policy, or policies that are slightly different from each other state because of the fact that they have local needs to fulfill. At the same time, at a basic level, in terms of education, health, those basic rights, you need to have some kind of an equivalent system between the states. You can't have too much disparities there, right? Because, because of the fact that those are basic rights, right? If it's basic rights, and that needs to be fulfilled by every state sector, right? So the way I see it is that I think, every state has to deal with the fact that, with their producers of this technology, and have to ensure that, the products are, equally shared, that especially those essential products, especially when it comes to things like health, education, etc., are common to everybody, right? That is going to be fundamental. And that is, when you talk about political economy of communications, those are the kinds of issues. To what extent are there disparities at a state level? To what extent are these disparities because of the kinds of structures of production, digital production? To what extent are there policies that support the fact that digital products are widely shared? Those are important things that need to be considered.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Sir, this is the time of formal vote of thanks as well. Today, we have with us Professor Pradip Thomas, one of the finest mind of the globe, the field of communication and the digital media is concerned. Those are watching in YouTube and Facebook throughout across the globe. I must thank you to all. And these co-host patronage associations with Indian Institute of Management, Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Vice Chancellor, Central University, Professor Sarath Kumar Palita, and Professor Sanjay Kumar Naik, Vice Chancellor, Ravenshaw University as well. And the conveners of this World Human Sciences and Management Conference as well, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent policymaker and activist Charudattu Paningrai. Along with Professor B.C. Das, Professor Sudarshan Mishra, Professor Srinivasa Luenes, and Professor Mishra as well for their valuable support and give us advice time to time. And last but not the least, the team card, Dr. Subham Das, Dr. Rudranarayan Das, Dr. Nugur Patnaik, Dr. Neha Sharma, Dr. Kamal Prasad Mahanti, Dr. Samuel Lima, and Dr. Chinmay Kumar Sahu as well. Once again, I'm glad to thank you all, the participants. Without you and your support, this effort cannot make his grand success. And again, the core of my heart, very thank you so much, sir, for all the way you connected with us from Australia and sharing your valuable thoughts and looking forward for future engagement also. Thank you so much, sir. The meeting is concluded now.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir. And sir, namaste from India, sir. Namaste.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.